I inherited $13 million and thought it was the answer to every prayer I had ever whispered in the dark. But I had no idea that what should have been a blessing would open the door to betrayal, pain, and a truth I was never prepared to face. And before I begin, I want to say something from the heart. Because if you are listening right now, your simple like or a comment is not just a button on the screen, but a reminder that these stories matter and that someone out there is listening. And it is only because of your support that I find the strength to share them. My name is Rachel, I am 27 years old, and my life before that letter arrived was far from golden. It was a daily struggle with unpaid bills, secondhand clothes, and a husband who seemed more like a roommate growing colder by the day than a partner who once promised to love me. And while I tried to carry us forward with hope and small gestures of love, it always felt like I was pouring water into a broken cup. Our apartment was small and tired, its faded carpets worn thin where our footsteps had carved invisible paths. The kitchen smelled constantly of other people's cooking from the neighbors downstairs, and the walls were so thin they carried not only the echoes of laughter, but the sting of arguments from strangers. And in the middle of all that noise and weariness, I tried to build a little nest of peace, lighting candles when I could, placing flowers in old glass jars on the windowsill, and cooking meals that stretched farther than they should have. But no matter what I did, the air between us always felt heavy. Mark, my husband, was 32, and when I met him, I thought he was the kind of man who could carry the world on his shoulders. He had ambition in his smile and confidence in every word he spoke, and I believed that standing beside him meant building a future together. Yet years later, that promise had faded into silence. His eyes met mine less often. His words carried irritation instead of tenderness, and his presence in the apartment was more absence than comfort. And with every paycheck that dissolved before the month was through, I felt myself shrinking into the shadows of my own life. It was in the middle of one of those gray mornings, when the world outside the window felt colder than it should have, that I opened the mailbox and found a letter thicker and heavier than the usual stack of bills and unwanted advertisements, the paper embossed with a golden seal that instantly made my heart pound. And as I tore it open with trembling fingers, I found myself staring at words that seemed too impossible to be true. A formal statement from a lawyer's office in Boston, informing me that a distant cousin of my father, a man I barely remembered meeting once as a child, had passed away and named me his sole heir, leaving behind an estate worth $13 million. My breath caught as the number burned into my vision, my palms sweaty as I reread it again and again, trying to anchor myself in reality, because how could a girl who counted quarters at the grocery store suddenly hold wealth beyond imagination? And as the thought sank deeper into my bones, I felt the tears welling not from sadness, but from the sudden, shocking weight of possibility. I imagined paying off every debt that had chained us for years, buying a real home where sunlight could fall across polished floors, gifting my mother the peace she deserved after a lifetime of sacrifice, and even giving myself permission to dream again. And yet the very first face I saw in my mind was Mark's, because I believed, even then, that this news could bring us back together, that love might be rekindled with the flame of hope this fortune carried. And so I slipped the letter into my purse, pressed my hand over it as though to guard the miracle inside, and rushed out into the gray morning air, my feet almost flying, as I imagined the moment of joy we would share when I told him, never realizing that destiny had already stretched its hand across my path, and what awaited me at the next intersection was not celebration, but a silence so brutal it would change everything I thought I knew about life, marriage, and the cost of love. The morning air was damp with the kind of chill that seeps into your skin and lingers, carrying the smell of rain-soaked pavement and exhaust from buses that rumbled down the street. And as I hurried along the sidewalk, clutching my purse with the letter pressed tightly inside, I felt a strange mixture of giddy anticipation and uneasy tension, as though my body already knew that joy and disaster often walk hand in hand, though my mind refused to believe anything could taint the miracle I had just received. Every step carried me closer to Mark, and in my imagination I rehearsed how I would show him the letter, how I would watch his weary face soften into astonishment, how we would laugh together at the absurdity of our luck, and perhaps even hold each other again the way we hadn't in years, and those hopeful images glowed so brightly in my thoughts that I barely noticed the traffic light ahead had already begun flashing red. Cars roared past in impatient bursts, their horns cutting through the morning air like warnings I refused to hear, and the drizzle that had begun to fall blurred my vision, just enough to make the world shimmer. But still I walked quickly, my mind lost in the future, picturing the trips we could take, the debts we could erase, the chance to finally start over without the bitterness of unpaid bills hanging above us like storm clouds. I thought of my mother's face when I told her she would never again have to carry trays in a diner, of my own chance to breathe without the tightness of fear, and for a fleeting moment it felt as though the weight of years had lifted off my shoulders, replaced with wings I had never been given before. I clutched the strap of my bag tighter, the paper inside like a heartbeat against my palm, and told myself I had to hurry, because happiness, once within reach, cannot be delayed. The screech of tires came too late for me to react, a violent ripping of sound that shattered the dream I had been spinning in my head, and before I could turn, before I could scream, the world slammed into me with a force that stole the air from my lungs and replaced it with crushing silence. The impact sent me tumbling into darkness, where everything slowed and stretched as though time itself had fractured, and the last thing I remember before everything went black was the faint echo of my own name in my mind, Rachel, as though I was calling myself back to a life that was slipping through my fingers. There was no pain at first, only the shock of sudden nothingness, the kind of emptiness that makes you question if you still exist at all, and then mercifully there was only silence. When I opened my eyes again, it was to the harsh white glare of hospital lights and the antiseptic scent that clung to every corner of the room, a sterile brightness that felt almost cruel after the gray drizzle of the street, and I realized with a heavy throb in my chest that I was alive, broken but breathing, and utterly alone. Machines beeped steadily beside me, tubes ran from my arm, and the taste of metal lingered on my tongue as I tried to move, but the weight of my body felt foreign, as if I had been borrowed back from the edge of something final. I reached instinctively for my purse, desperate to feel the paper inside, and when my fingers brushed against the leather strap by my bedside, I whispered inside myself a silent prayer that the letter had survived, because in that fragile moment, with no one there to hold my hand, the promise of $13 million was not wealth anymore. It was survival, it was hope, and it was the only anchor I had to remind me that this story was not over yet. The hours after the accident blurred together in a haze of morphine dreams and half-heard conversations, and though my body lay tethered to machines that hissed and beeped in steady rhythm, my mind wandered restlessly between the shock of survival and the longing for someone who never arrived. I turned my head toward the door with every creak of footsteps in the hallway, believing foolishly that Mark would appear at any moment, his face filled with worry, his arms ready to wrap around me, whispering that everything would be fine. But the doorway remained empty, and the only visitors I received were nurses adjusting tubes, doctors murmuring notes, and the silence of loneliness pressing heavier with each passing hour. I tried to tell myself that maybe he didn't know yet, that perhaps no one had reached him, or that his work had tied him up and he would come running as soon as he could, and I clung to that fragile excuse the way a drowning person clings to driftwood, because the alternative, that he chose not to be there, was too cruel to face. Each time the nurse changed my IV, she offered a sympathetic smile that told me more than her words ever could, a kind of pity reserved for those abandoned, and in the quiet moments when pain made my eyes burn with tears, I pressed my face into the stiff hospital pillow so no one would see me breaking. Days slipped by, measured not by clocks but by the endless rotation of breakfast trays, medication rounds, and the slow shift of sunlight across the linoleum floor, and still he never came. Not a call, not a message, not even a single flower by my bedside. My body was bruised and fractured, but it was my heart that carried the deeper wound, because in the very moment I needed him most, in the moment I believed our marriage could be salvaged by hope and fortune, he had vanished without a trace. The silence became louder than the machines, louder than the voices of staff, louder even than my own thoughts, until I could no longer deny that absence was not an accident, but a choice. And when I finally found the strength to pick up the phone with trembling hands and call him, hoping for an apology, a sliver of comfort, or even just the sound of his voice to remind me I wasn't entirely forgotten, what I heard instead pierced me deeper than the accident ever could. His tone was cold, distant, and when I begged him to come, to be with me, he dismissed me with a sharpness that left me breathless, saying he had no time for a loser, as if my survival, my suffering, and my very existence were nothing more than an inconvenience. In that moment, lying broken in a hospital bed with the man I loved spitting cruelty instead of care, I realized that the fortune waiting for me meant nothing compared to the truth staring me in the face. I was utterly alone, and the person I trusted most had already turned his back. The words he threw at me over the phone echoed in my head long after the line went dead, each syllable cutting deeper than the bruises that covered my body. Because in all the years of our strained marriage, I had never heard such contempt in his voice, and I kept replaying it, wondering how a man I once believed I loved could dismiss me as though I were nothing more than a burden to be cast aside. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the antiseptic lights blurring into tears, and the truth began to unravel in painful strands. He hadn't been too busy. He hadn't been caught in circumstances. He had chosen not to care. And the thought that my husband's absence was deliberate weighed on me like a stone pressing into my chest. As the hours slipped into another night of restless dozing, memories began to creep in with sharper clarity than they had in years. The small moments I once ignored suddenly forming a pattern I couldn't deny. The unexplained late evenings, when his phone went unanswered, the way he turned his body away from mine in bed as if distance had already become his comfort, the irritation in his voice when I asked about his day, and the hollow smile he offered when I cooked dinners he barely touched. I had convinced myself those things were normal wear on a marriage, that every couple struggled, that love could survive the erosion of time, but now, lying broken and alone, I saw them for what they truly were, signs of a man who had left me long before this accident ever did. The strangest part was how quickly pity gave way to anger, not the fiery anger of rage, but the slow-burning ember of realization that I had been carrying the weight of a marriage built on nothing but my own hope, and I wondered bitterly how I had been so blind, how I had mistaken his silence for exhaustion, his distance for stress, his sharp words for fleeting moods. With every passing hour in that hospital bed, I felt my grief shift into something harder, something sharper, as if the cracks in my heart were beginning to form the outline of armor, and while part of me still longed for him to walk through the door with flowers and regret, another part began whispering that even if he did, it would never be enough. It was in that fragile space between despair and awakening that the nurse, while adjusting the drip at my bedside, let slip a comment that twisted the knife further than I thought possible. She mentioned casually that she had seen him in the hospital once, not entering my room, not asking about me, but walking quickly down the hall with a woman at his side, their heads bent together in the kind of closeness I hadn't felt in years. I froze, my breath catching, my heart pounding as though the accident had struck again, because if that was true, then his absence was not only a choice, but a betrayal. And suddenly the letter, with its promise of $13 million, felt less like a gift, and more like bait in a trap I didn't even know I was in. The nurse's words refused to leave me, replaying again and again like a cruel refrain. And though she spoke them without malice, almost in passing, they planted a seed of suspicion that grew roots faster than I could silence it, because if Mark had been seen in the hospital with another woman, then his absence from my side was not born of indifference alone. It was layered with secrecy and deceit. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself perhaps it was a colleague or a friend. But even as I formed the excuses, I felt the hollowness of my own lies, because deep down I already knew there was a truth I had been too afraid to face. Whispers seemed to follow me in the quiet spaces of the hospital, carried in the sympathetic glances of the staff, in the way one nurse asked gently if my husband would be visiting soon, and in the silence that fell when I could not answer. Each comment, each look, each hesitation became another confirmation of what my heart had begun to accept. That while I lay bruised and aching, clinging to the belief that marriage meant loyalty, Mark was elsewhere, perhaps even celebrating a freedom he had long craved. The realization carved through me not with sudden fury, but with a cold, steady ache, as if every nerve in my body was learning a new kind of pain. Late at night, when the corridors grew silent except for the distant hum of machines, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder if I had ever truly known him at all. If the man I married had always been a stranger wearing the mask of love, or if he had once been sincere before life and greed twisted him into someone else. I remembered the promises we had whispered in younger days, the dreams we had painted together on fragile canvases of hope, and the way I clung to those memories like life rafts, refusing to believe they had all been illusions, but with every unanswered call, every empty hour, every rumor I pieced together, the picture became clearer and crueler. Still, in my weakness and pain, I longed for proof. Something tangible that would confirm or deny the whispers tormenting me. And though my body was confined to that hospital bed, my mind began to wander down darker paths, asking questions I had never dared to ask before, questions that made my pulse quicken and my chest tighten. What if he was not just absent, not just indifferent, but already gone in every way that mattered? What if his life had already moved forward without me, while mine had been shattered in an instant? And what if the inheritance I had thought would save us was, in truth, the very thing that had driven him away? It was on the 4th morning after the accident, when I had nearly convinced myself he would never come, that I heard the distinct sound of footsteps outside my door, heavier and more deliberate than the soft shuffle of nurses or the hurried pace of doctors, and something deep inside me stirred, a strange mix of dread and desperate hope. Because even after all the silence, a part of me still longed to believe he would appear with the concern I had begged for. When the door opened, there he was, standing tall in a crisp jacket, his face freshly shaven, his hair carefully styled as though he were arriving at a celebration instead of the bedside of his broken wife. And for a fleeting second, my heart leapt, ready to forgive everything just for the comfort of seeing him. But the illusion collapsed instantly when I saw the woman walking at his side, her hand brushing against his as though it had every right to rest there, her eyes alive with the kind of pride a wife carries when she believes she belongs. And in that single instant, the room shrank around me until I could hardly breathe, because the man who had abandoned me had not only stayed away, he had replaced me. The betrayal struck with such force that for a moment I wondered if I was hallucinating, if the medication had conjured a cruel mirage designed to torment me. But there was nothing ghostly about the way she leaned into him, nothing unreal in the warmth of her hand resting so naturally on his arm, nothing imagined in the way his eyes slid past me with only the faintest flicker of acknowledgement, as if I were a stranger occupying a bed that happened to cross his path. My chest ached, not only from the bruises of the accident, but from the realization that love, loyalty, and years of shared life had been erased so quickly it was as if I had never existed at all. I tried to push myself up on trembling arms, my body weak but my soul burning with the need to confront this nightmare, yet the words refused to leave my throat, silenced by the weight of his indifference and the shock of her presence. And then, without hesitation, without shame, he introduced her as his wife, each syllable spoken with the casual tone of a man reciting the day's weather, as though my existence in that room was an inconvenience rather than a wound carved open by his betrayal. The air thickened as my mind spiraled, memories crashing into me with cruel precision. Every late night he brushed off with excuses, every unanswered call that left me awake and waiting, every cold glance across the dinner table that I pretended not to notice, all of it now falling neatly into place, rewriting our marriage as nothing more than a series of lies I had chosen to believe. The nurses passing in the hallway slowed for a moment to glance inside, their eyes darting away quickly as if ashamed to witness the spectacle, and I felt stripped bare, humiliated in a way deeper than words, lying in a hospital bed while the man who had sworn to cherish me stood proudly beside another woman. My breath caught in my chest. My pulse raced with fury and grief, and I longed to scream, to demand an explanation, to rip the smug serenity from his face, but the paralysis of shock held me in place, forcing me to drown in silence as the reality of my replacement settled into my bones. And then it happened. The moment when everything that had already crumbled was crushed further under the weight of an unbearable truth. The woman at his side, so polished, so self-assured, turned her gaze fully onto me, and I watched as the color drained from her face, her confident smile evaporating in an instant as recognition dawned in her eyes like lightning splitting the night. She staggered back a step, her perfectly manicured hand trembling as it flew to her mouth, and the sound that escaped her was not the laugh of a rival or the voice of someone triumphant, but the broken gasp of someone staring at a ghost she never expected to see. Her chest rose and fell in quick bursts, her eyes locked on mine with horror, and her voice cracked as she whispered words that filled the sterile hospital room with a tension so sharp it sliced through the silence. "Oh my God, she's my..." And in that unfinished sentence, in that raw terror spilling from her lips, I understood that this nightmare was not just betrayal. It was the opening of a secret far darker than anything I had dared to imagine. The unfinished words trembled in the air like a storm about to break, and for a moment the hospital room seemed to lose its walls, the fluorescent light above me blurring into a harsh halo that made everything feel both surreal and suffocating, as if I had slipped into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The machines at my side beeped steadily, mocking me with their calm rhythm, while inside my chest my heart thundered violently, and I stared at her with wide, searching eyes, willing her to finish what she had begun, because I knew with every instinct in me that the truth she carried was not a small revelation, but something so enormous it had shaken her to the core. Her lips quivered, her manicured fingers pressed against her mouth as though holding back the rest of the sentence, and I felt my throat tighten, whispering silently in my mind, "Say it. Tell me what you see." But she stayed frozen, caught between horror and denial, leaving me drowning in a silence that felt sharper than knives. It was Mark who shattered that silence, not with comfort or explanation, but with irritation, his voice cutting through the room like a blade as he snapped at her to compose herself, his grip tightening around her arm with a possessiveness that reeked of control. And in that single moment, the mask he always wore slipped enough for me to glimpse what lay beneath. His eyes flickered toward me, and then back to her, not with the confusion of a man blindsided, but with the weary frustration of someone who had expected this moment to come, someone who already knew the secret that had just detonated between us. And suddenly I understood that her reaction had not surprised him at all. It had only inconvenienced him. She tore her gaze away from me, blinking rapidly as tears threatened to ruin the perfect lines of her makeup, and in her trembling, I recognized something achingly familiar, a mirror of my own fragility, and it was in that reflection that the pieces began to click into place. Memories I had long buried rose from the shadows with ruthless clarity, whispers from relatives I had dismissed as gossip, fragments of conversations overheard in childhood about my father's unexplained absences, hints of another family he might have visited, and one faint memory from years ago of a little girl I had glimpsed at a reunion, a child with dark hair and eyes that looked eerily like mine. I had carried those suspicions like smoke, intangible and easy to brush away, telling myself I had imagined them, that my father was simply busy, that no one would live such a double life. But now, staring at this woman who stood beside my husband, watching her shake as the truth poured from her eyes, though not yet her lips, I felt those old doubts harden into reality. The realization hit me so hard I gripped the edge of the hospital bed until my knuckles turned white, my body trembling not from pain but from recognition, because I finally saw it in her face. The shape of our jaw, the arch of our brows, the shadow of resemblance that could not be denied. She wasn't just another woman who had taken what belonged to me. She was my blood, my half-sister. The weight of that truth suffocated me, pressing down on my chest until I thought I might collapse under it, because the betrayal was no longer just the betrayal of a husband discarding his injured wife like yesterday's news. It was also the betrayal of a father who had kept a second life hidden in shadows, leaving me to discover a sister in the cruelest possible way. My mind spiraled through 1,000 questions I could not ask, each one cutting deeper than the last. Did Mark know she was my sister all along? Did he seek her out deliberately? Did he use her as part of his plan to reach the fortune I had just inherited? Or was she as much a victim of his charm as I had once been? Her voice finally broke through the suffocating silence, faint and shaking, and though she barely whispered the words, they crashed through me like thunder. She's my sister. In that moment, the room spun violently, my body heavy against the sheets, my heart splintering into shards, because the fortune I had believed would save me had not only destroyed my marriage, but also dragged into the light a family secret so vile and so devastating that nothing in my life, not love, not blood, not even my very sense of self, would ever be whole again. The confession lingered in the sterile air long after her trembling voice fell silent, and though the words were simple, their weight was crushing, wrapping around me like chains I could not break, forcing me to confront not only the betrayal of my marriage, but the darker betrayal of my very bloodline. My body trembled under the weight of it, not from pain or medication, but from the sheer devastation of knowing that the woman beside my husband was not a stranger or even a rival, but my half-sister, a hidden echo of my father's secret life. I stared at her face, searching for denial, for some shred of evidence that this was a mistake. But the resemblance screamed louder than her broken whisper. And as the truth settled over me, I felt my identity fracture in ways I had never thought possible. My husband had discarded me, my father had deceived me, and my sister, though innocent in her own right, stood unknowingly as the final blow to what little remained of the life I thought I had. Yet it was not her sorrow that twisted deepest into me. It was his silence, his cold detachment as he stood between us, unmoved by the chaos that had erupted, and in that silence I recognized something chilling. Mark was not surprised. He was not confused. He was not even shaken. He looked at me the way a man looks at a chessboard after making a decisive move, calm, calculating, and quietly confident. And in that moment, the pieces began to fall into place with terrifying clarity. Every absence, every unanswered call, every cold dismissal was no accident, no coincidence, but part of a pattern I had been too blind to see. And now, with the clarity born of betrayal, I realized he had known about her from the beginning. He had chosen her deliberately, pulled her into his orbit with a precision that made my stomach turn, because my inheritance was not just a gift waiting for me. It was the prize he had been circling like a predator long before the letter ever arrived. The more I thought about it, the more the fragments of our past began to rearrange into something grotesque and undeniable. The late nights he brushed off with vague excuses, the sudden shift in his wardrobe and grooming habits, the way he began speaking with a kind of arrogance he had never possessed before, as if he were preparing for a new role, a new life. Even his tone on the phone when he dismissed me as a loser now sounded different in my memory. Not careless, but deliberate, as though he wanted me to stay broken, wanted me to give up, wanted me to fade into the background so that he could continue weaving his plans without interruption. My accident had not derailed him. It had accelerated his timeline, giving him the excuse to step fully into the new life he had already built, a life that now stood exposed before me in the form of my sister by his side. I lay there with the weight of that realization pressing down on me like the wreckage of the accident all over again. But instead of breaking me, it began to ignite something deeper, a quiet fury that pushed back against the numbness. I had been blind. I had been naive. I had believed in the fairy tale of love that was nothing more than manipulation. But now the veil had lifted, and the truth, as horrifying as it was, gave me strength. He thought I was powerless, that my broken body and broken spirit would keep me silent, but he had underestimated me. I had $13 million secured in my name, and with it, I had the means to unravel the web he had spun around me. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe through the pain, and I vowed in that moment that I would not confront him yet. I would not scream, or beg, or demand answers, because revenge is never born in rage. It is born in patience, and mine had just begun. The days that followed passed not in peace or healing, but in a storm of restless thoughts, and though my body was still weak, stitched and bruised, my mind sharpened with every hour, no longer clouded by denial, but lit with a clarity born of betrayal, because once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen, and I began to realize that the greatest mistake I could make now would be to confront them too soon. Mark believed he had won, believed my accident had left me broken beyond repair, believed that his new life with my sister was secured, but he had no idea that beneath the quiet shell of the woman lying in the hospital bed, a fire had begun to burn, a fire that would consume the lies he had built. I stared at the ceiling at night and felt the shift inside me, the transformation from victim to survivor, and though my body ached with every movement, I began to nurture that fire in silence. It was during one of those long nights that I remembered the words of my grandmother, a woman who had lived through hardship with a resilience that had always amazed me, who used to tell me in her calm, steady voice that strength is not in the roar of anger, but in the patience to wait for the right moment to strike. I could almost hear her voice in the quiet hum of the machines, reminding me that revenge is not rushed, that true justice comes when your enemy least expects it, and with that memory, I began to plan. The letter from the lawyer had survived the accident, still folded neatly in my purse by my bedside, and I clutched it in my hands like a lifeline, because in it lay not just the inheritance, but the power to rebuild my life on my own terms. I called the lawyer secretly, my voice still weak but steady enough, and I ensured that every detail of the estate, every asset, every dollar was secured in my name alone, locked beyond the reach of anyone who might try to manipulate or claim it. The act of taking control, even from a hospital bed, gave me a strength I hadn't felt in years, and slowly, carefully, I began to map the pieces of my life that had been shattered, not to restore them as they were, but to reshape them into something new, something stronger. I thought of Mark and his smug detachment, of the way he looked at me as if I were already erased, and I promised myself that he would come to regret underestimating me. I thought of Lily, my sister in blood but stranger in truth, and I wondered if she was another pawn or a willing accomplice, but I decided that her reckoning would come in time, because whether she had known or not, she had stepped into my life with my husband on her arm, and for that the weight of truth would crush her too. I used the long hours of recovery not to despair but to prepare, gathering information, replaying every memory, watching every small clue with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. By the time I was finally discharged from the hospital, walking slowly with the help of a cane, but carrying myself with a strength that far outweighed my fragile frame, I was no longer the woman who had been struck down in the street, or the wife who had begged for her husband's presence. I was reborn in silence, carrying not just the scars of the accident, but the resolve of someone who had faced the abyss and chosen not to fall. I walked out into the daylight with the inheritance secured, my plans locked inside me like a secret weapon, and though the world still saw me as fragile, I smiled to myself because I knew the truth. My suffering had been their game, but the end of the game would belong to me. The invitation came not to me, but to the world around me. A grand announcement whispered through family circles and shared with colleagues. A lavish dinner to celebrate Mark's new marriage and his step into a brighter, more powerful future. And though I was not meant to hear of it, whispers have a way of finding their way to the people most wounded by them. I listened silently as a distant cousin mentioned it during a casual visit, the words dripping with envy at the opulence promised, and though my chest tightened with anger, I felt an almost cruel smile rise within me, because this was the moment I had been waiting for. He believed I was gone, erased, forgotten, a shadow of the woman he once called his wife, and he wanted to present his new life to the world as though I had never existed. But I still existed, and with every ounce of pain he had inflicted, I had built a strength he could never fathom. The night of the dinner, I dressed not in mourning black, or the muted tones of a woman still healing, but in an elegant gown that carried dignity and quiet power, my silver earrings catching the light as I stepped from the car. I walked slowly, the cane at my side not as a mark of weakness but as a reminder of what I had endured, every step deliberate, every movement chosen. And when I entered the hall, conversation stilled like the abrupt hush before a storm. Faces turned, eyes widened, forks paused midair, because no one had expected to see me, not alive, not standing, not radiant in defiance, and the silence grew heavy as I made my way to the center of the room. Mark's face drained of color, his confident smile faltering for the first time in months, and Lily's glass trembled in her hand, her eyes darting to mine with the guilt of a woman trapped in a web she could no longer ignore. I stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of my presence do what words could not, and then, with a calm that belied the storm raging inside me, I spoke clearly enough for every ear in the room to hear. I revealed the truth of the inheritance, the $13 million secured solely in my name, and I watched as his jaw tightened, his mask cracking under the force of a reality he could not spin to his advantage. Gasps rippled across the room, whispers rose in frantic waves, and still I held my ground, not shouting, not weeping, but speaking with the steady tone of a woman who had nothing left to fear. Mark tried to interrupt, to belittle me with a sneer and dismissive words, but his attempt only exposed the venom in his voice, and the crowd recoiled, seeing in him the cruelty I had long hidden from the world. Then I dropped the final spark, revealing not only his betrayal, but the documents and conversations I had uncovered, the proof of his schemes, the lies he had spun around us all, the calculated steps he had taken to position himself beside Lily with the intent of stealing what was never his. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, a suffocating pause before the storm of voices that erupted. But I stood calm, my eyes never leaving his, watching as his confidence crumbled piece by piece. He had expected a broken woman to haunt him quietly, but instead he faced a survivor who had risen from the ashes to confront him in front of everyone he sought to impress. For the first time since the accident, I felt the balance shift in my favor, and though the night was not yet over, I knew in my bones that the reckoning he had feared had finally begun. The air in the banquet hall grew so heavy it felt almost unbreathable as I handed over the folder, my hand steady, though my heart thundered inside my chest, and as the first pages were pulled free, a hush fell over the room, deeper than any silence I had ever known. Each sheet, each printed line carried the evidence of betrayal that I had pieced together during the long hours of recovery, and now, under the cold glow of chandeliers, those secrets were no longer mine alone, but shared with every person present. There were forged signatures meant to mimic mine, contracts that would have transferred assets away from me, accounts carefully hidden in places he believed I would never uncover, and memos of meetings that proved he had plotted my erasure for months, perhaps years. The pages moved from hand to hand like a contagion, infecting each new reader with shock and disbelief until gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, and the weight of undeniable truth pressed down on the man who had thought himself untouchable. Mark's face flushed with an anger he could no longer disguise, his jaw tightening, his fists clenched, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's, and in that unraveling mask, I saw the man he truly was, stripped bare by the evidence he could not silence. Lily's hand trembled as she took the documents, her fingers leaving faint smudges on the crisp paper as she scanned the lines that spelled out her part in his schemes, her name appearing not in declarations of love, but in cold calculations of utility, as if she were nothing more than a piece on his board. I watched the color drain from her face as realization struck, her polished composure crumbling into raw devastation, her lips parting as if to speak but finding no words, only the sharp breath of betrayal. For so long she had believed herself chosen, cherished, the center of his devotion, but now the truth laid bare that she had been used, her role no greater than a bridge to wealth he could never earn on his own. Her eyes flicked to me, wide and wounded, as though searching for confirmation, for solidarity in the shared sting of betrayal. And though my heart twisted with pity, I let the silence speak, because sometimes no words can soften the cruelty of truth. Her mascara blurred into dark streaks down her cheeks as she whispered hoarsely, not to me but to him, a question I could read in her broken expression, even without hearing it. How could you do this to me? And the sight of her shattered belief was both a dagger and a balm, proof that even those who walked into my life as enemies could bleed from his cruelty too. Mark, cornered and desperate, erupted with the fury of a man who has lost control, his voice rising with venom as he tried to twist the story into something it was not, claiming I had manipulated events, that I had fabricated evidence, that I was playing the victim for sympathy. He pointed at me with shaking hands, his words tumbling over each other in a torrent of accusations, calling me bitter, jealous, unstable, anything that might turn the tide back in his favor. But the louder he grew, the more transparent he became, his arrogance no longer mistaken for strength but revealed as weakness, his desperation painted across every sneer and every raised syllable. Friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Family members looked down in shame. Colleagues exchanged disgusted glances, and the room that had once been filled with admiration now looked at him as though seeing a stranger. He pounded the table, his voice cracking as he tried to reclaim authority, but authority cannot be shouted back into existence once truth has stripped it away. And with every word he spoke, the walls closed in tighter around him. And then came the final blow, not from me, not from the documents, but from Lily herself, as she stepped back from his side, her body shaking, her voice trembling as she told him she was done, that she could not stand beside a man who had reduced her to a pawn and betrayed her in front of everyone she knew. The distance she created between them was more powerful than any evidence, because it was the collapse of his last illusion, the severing of the bond he had flaunted as proof of his triumph. The banquet hall, once buzzing with music and laughter, now hung in stunned silence, every guest bearing witness to the fall of a man who had thought himself untouchable, and I stood at the center of it all, not gloating, not raging, but calm, steady, unshaken. For the first time since the accident, I felt justice in its truest form. Not revenge born of fury, but justice born of exposure. The kind that leaves a man destroyed not by violence but by his own choices, his own greed, his own arrogance. He had abandoned me in my weakest hour, and now, before the eyes of all who mattered to him, he stood abandoned in return, stripped of power, stripped of loyalty, and stripped of the lies that once protected him. When the banquet finally disintegrated into silence, and the last of the guests slipped away, leaving behind half-finished plates and whispers they dared not speak aloud in my presence, I stood alone in the middle of the grand room, the echo of my cane against the marble floor steady and unyielding. Around me lay the wreckage of what Mark had tried to build. Champagne glasses toppled on their sides, chairs left in hurried disarray, the heavy scent of roasted meats and expensive wine now cloying in the stagnant air, and in the center of it all, like a broken monument to his own arrogance, sat the man I had once called my husband. His shoulders hunched, his eyes hollow, his face drained of every trace of pride, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked small, stripped of the false grandeur he wore like armor. I felt no pity as I watched him sink into his disgrace, because pity is wasted on those who cut others open with deliberate cruelty, and what I felt instead was the sharp, cold satisfaction of justice, the kind of justice that doesn't arrive in fire or fury, but in silence, in the slow crumbling of a man's carefully constructed mask until there is nothing left but dust. In the days that followed, I watched from a distance as his world collapsed, with a speed even I had not anticipated. And though wealth and power can sometimes shield men from consequence, they could not shield him from the truth now living in every whisper that followed his name. The business partners who once clinked glasses with him withdrew with disgust. Family members who had once praised his ambition now avoided him in shame. And the friends who had laughed at his jokes no longer answered his calls, leaving him alone in the hollow shell of his own disgrace. Lily, my half-sister, unraveled too, her polished image shattered into raw humiliation, her tears staining every whispered conversation that spread like wildfire through the family. She had been a pawn in his game, and though part of me recognized her as another victim, I could not forget that she had still walked proudly into that banquet hall with my husband on her arm while I lay in a hospital bed abandoned, and so my heart, though not filled with hatred, could not extend forgiveness either. She had her reckoning, and she would carry it as I carried mine, alone. For me, there would be no return to the fragile ties of family or the false promises of marriage, because both had been poisoned, and I chose to cut the rope before it strangled me further. With the inheritance fully secured, I understood that I now carried not only wealth but a responsibility, not to save those who had betrayed me, but to rebuild the pieces of myself they had tried to break. I bought a home filled with light and air, wide windows that opened to the sun, rooms so large that silence no longer pressed on me like a threat, but soothed me like a balm. I walked barefoot across polished floors and felt the freedom of space, each step a reminder that I no longer lived in the cage of someone else's contempt. But wealth alone was not enough to erase the scars. It was only a tool, and I chose to wield it with purpose. I created a foundation in my grandmother's name, honoring the woman whose words of strength had guided me in my darkest hours, and through it I reached out to women who had been abandoned, broken, left behind as I once was. I sat across from them, listening to their stories, watching their eyes widen when they realized they were not alone, and in their voices I heard echoes of my own pain, but also the same spark of survival that had carried me through. In helping them rise, I stitched together the torn fabric of my own soul, piece by piece, until I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as proof that devastation can become rebirth. Now, looking back, I see the accident not as the cruelest day of my life, but as the moment the curtain was torn away, revealing truths I had spent too long refusing to face. Wealth does not corrupt, it exposes, and in its glow Mark revealed himself as nothing but greed and cruelty wrapped in charm, while I discovered that beneath my quiet desperation lived a strength he could never take from me. Evil, I learned, is not punished by external hands. It carries the seeds of its own destruction, and given time, it always devours itself, leaving only emptiness behind. He abandoned me when I was broken, believing I would fade quietly into nothing, yet here I stand, stronger than ever, while he wanders through the ruins of the life he built on lies. That is the justice he earned, and that is the peace I carry. Not because I destroyed him, but because I allowed him to destroy himself. And if you have walked with me through this story, if it has stirred something inside you, I want to thank you with all my heart. Please leave a comment, tell me where you are listening from, because your voices remind me that stories of survival matter, and with your support, I will continue to share them, one truth at a time.